Two surprising legal actions were announced today. The NPA reversed an earlier decision and will now press ahead with culpable homicide charges against former President Jacob Zuma's son Duduzane, while AfriForum wants a private prosecution order against EFF leader Julius Malema. For some legal analysis on these announcements, we're joined via Skype by legal expert Tyrone Maseko. Good evening to you, Tyrone. Thank you so much for your time on the program today. So let's start off with the Duduzane Zuma case. We know this was initially a case that was put through an inquest. The inquest seemed to reveal that Duduzane Zuma should indeed be prosecuted. The NPA, however, decided not to go ahead and do it until AfriForum had asked for a certificate, essentially declaring that the NPA was not going to continue with this prosecution and it would therefore proceed with one of its own. How effective has AfriForum been in ensuring that the letter of the law is carried out in this case?
You know, Joanne, we'll never really know whether the afterthought by the NPA is a result of the pressure by AfriForum. Suffice it to state that, the NPA has now thought twice. And I'm not surprised that they have, because the danger for the NPA here is that if there is indeed a prima facie case against Duduzane Zuma and it is prosecuted privately, be it AfriForum or another party, then it would reflect very badly on the NPA, because it would start to raise questions as to why the NPA didn't prosecute the matter, as they are the body that is tasked with actually instituting prosecutions, criminal prosecutions.
Does it seem strange to you that given the outcome of the inquest, that this case was not prosecuted in the first place, Tyrone?
It does. I mean, it starts to beg the question, why not? If the recommendation that has come out of the inquest is that there is substantial proof in a prima facie case, then it seems obvious that the NPA should then pursue the case. Remember that, Joanne, that ultimately the NPA doesn't have to take on a case simply because it is convinced 100% that there couldn't possibly be another outcome. There simply has to be a prima facie case, and then they have to leave it to the court to make a finding. So it's not for the NPA to preempt the decisions of the court, and so then they should prosecute where there is evidence to prosecute matters.
So let's move on to the Julius Malema prosecution that AfriForum wants to bring. Clearly, we know the NPA will have to again issue a certificate saying that it doesn't intend to prosecute this case in order for any private organization to continue with prosecution. However, given the circumstances of this case and why it was struck off the roll in the first place, is the NPA likely to try to revive this case against Julius Malema?
I suppose they will have to, Joanne, for this reason. Ultimately, all these decisions really revolve around evidence. What evidence is there of any of the charges which the NPA might be contemplating? It seems in this case it is fraud and corruption. So the NPA has to always make its decision based on what they believe they could present to the court, and if there is any credible evidence. Now, we'll never know, not at this stage anyway, what evidence the NPA sits with, which is also the difficult position that the AfriForum will find itself in, because I listened to that interview, or at least the presser, and they seem very confident they can actually present a winnable case. And it begs the question, to my mind at least, as to what makes them so confident, because part of what the NPA enjoys is investigations by the South African police or any other arm of the state which assist them. The NPA would not have, or the AfriForum rather, would not have any of that evidence at this stage. So how then can they be confident that whatever case they would prefer against Julius Malema would actually succeed? Because they take a risk if let's assume all the they're able to skip all the procedural steps, which I think are insurmountable in my opinion in this case. But let's say for a moment that they actually do get there. The difficulty is that how then do they present all this evidence, and what evidence do they have to actually convict? So it's not an easy case for them. And I mentioned just now that part of the challenge that they face is that they have to establish locus standi in this matter. It cannot be a case of whoever decides that they want to prosecute a matter simply goes to court and prosecutes the matter. There are requirements, procedural requirements that they actually have to overcome, and I don't think they will in this case. I don't believe they've got locus standi.
So let's find out from you how this works in practice. If indeed the NPA hands AfriForum this certificate and says go ahead and prosecute this case, the body of evidence that the NPA has already gathered, can that in any way be used by AfriForum? Can it be obtained and successfully used in any such case they bring?
They can certainly request it. So here's the challenge that AfriForum faces. The certificate itself has to be clear as to which charges the state has preferred or has decided not to prosecute. So, and it has to be fairly detailed such that both parties, so the accused, ultimately Julius Malema, and AfriForum will know exactly what it is that the state has declined to prosecute. And why that is important is because if later on and at the beginning of the private prosecution, the AfriForum were to decide to prefer a different charge to what the NPA has declined to prosecute, then that prosecution couldn't possibly go ahead. So it is only those charges which the NPA has declined to prosecute that can be taken on a private prosecution, as it were.
So let me just ask you another question about the practice of this. Once a case like this gets going, I mean, if you look at the NPA's previous investigations, for example, one aspect that Harry Nell brings up is the illness of one witness, a witness who was severely depressed and therefore unable to give evidence in the initial investigation. If that has changed over the course of the years, how does that change the picture in terms of AfriForum's request to go ahead and prosecute this case?
Well, witnesses are the least of AfriForum's problems in this case, Joanne, and I know I'm departing somewhat from your question, but the problem that they have is this. The locus standi is a question of standing in court. AfriForum is an organization. The law is very clear that a private prosecution can only be brought by a person, and that person can either be a parent, or let's start with a wife or a husband of, let's say, a deceased or a person against whom an offense has been committed, or a child. Alternatively, a curator or, sorry, I lost my chain of thought for a moment, a legal guardian. Now, other than that, the only other category of persons who can actually bring a private prosecution, if you can prove that you've got a substantial and peculiar interest in the matter because you have suffered an injury as a result of the commission of the crime. Now, I look at this and I ask myself, how is it possible that the AfriForum could possibly define themselves in any one of the subcategories, because I don't see them fitting in under any one of the subcategories. It's slightly different in the Duduzane matter and in the other, Engels, I think it is lady, because there you actually have a victim, someone who could initiate the process. You can always co-opt a legal representative to run the trial, but the name of the private prosecutor, the person who's initiating the process, has to have that interest, that locus standi. I don't think that AfriForum will be able to get beyond that. As far as process goes, if they were to skip all those hurdles, they could certainly request that the NPA provide them with the docket and the contents of the docket. But what's also interesting is that the NPA always has the right to intervene and get involved in the process, and so take the prosecution away from the private prosecutor and continue the prosecution itself.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Thank you for explaining all these legal aspects to us so well. Legal expert Tyrone Maseko joining us there via Skype.